A British officer begged Rommel for mercy. This is what he said. The British officer did not beg while the battle was still being fought. He waited until the moment no commander wants to reach. The moment when the outcome is no longer in doubt, but the consequences are still unfolding. The guns had stopped firing, not because a ceasefire had been agreed upon, but because there was nothing left to fire at. The line he had been ordered to hold no longer existed. Units that had once formed a defensive system were gone, broken, scattered, or surrounded. Signals that had once carried orders now carried silence. Vehicles burned where they had stopped. Positions that had taken days to establish had disappeared in hours. And somewhere beyond the dust and fading smoke, German armor was already moving forward as if the battle had ended long before anyone acknowledged it. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the defeat itself, but how early it had actually happened. He stepped forward under a white flag. Not as a negotiator, not as a man trying to change the outcome, but as someone who had arrived too late to do either. He asked for mercy, and what Rommel said in response did not comfort him. It forced him to confront the one moment he had already lost, the moment when his decision could still have mattered. By the time this encounter took place, the war in North Africa had become something different from the rest of the Second World War. It was not a war of fixed lines. It was not a war of fortified positions. It was a war of movement, constant, shifting, and unforgiving. The desert offered no stability, no cover, no second chances. Distances stretched beyond what supply lines could reliably support. Fuel determined strategy as much as firepower. And time, more than anything else, decided outcomes. Rommel understood this with unusual precision. He did not wait for opportunities. He created them. He did not wait for the enemy to make mistakes. He forced them into situations where mistakes became inevitable. And most importantly, he did not fight the battle that was in front of him. He fought the one that would exist a few hours later. That difference, small in theory, decisive in practice, defined everything. The British officer believed in structure, in hierarchy, in the idea that war, even in chaos, could be managed through discipline and adherence to command. He trusted that the system would function, that orders would arrive, that support would follow, that the line, if held long enough, would stabilize. So when he was told to hold, he held. Even as the situation began to shift around him, even as neighboring units stopped responding, even as reports contradicted each other, he interpreted uncertainty as temporary, a delay, a breakdown in communication, not a collapse of the system itself. Because to accept that would require a different kind of decision, one that placed responsibility on him and not on the structure above him. So he remained, steady, committed, waiting for clarity that never came. Rommel's forces did not attack where they were expected. They moved where resistance was weakest. They avoided strength. They exploited gaps. They turned positions into liabilities simply by making them irrelevant. Strong points were bypassed. Supply lines were cut behind them. Communication broke down, and what had once been a coordinated defense became something else entirely. A collection of isolated units, each one unaware of how much the situation had already changed. The British officer continued to operate within the original plan, but the plan itself no longer applied. Orders referenced positions that no longer existed. Support was promised from units that had already been overrun. Time, quietly, decisively, moved past him, and with it, the opportunity to act. There was no single moment where everything failed. No clear signal, just a gradual shift. From control, to uncertainty, to isolation, to inevitability. By the time he recognized it fully, there was nothing left to decide. Before we step into the moment where the request was made, If you value these deep dives into the psychological turning points of history, consider subscribing to History Beyond Battle. We focus on the decisions, not just the battles, that determined outcomes and the exact moments where those outcomes could still be changed. When the firing stopped, it ended without warning. No signal, no negotiation, just silence. The kind that settles in when resistance no longer affects anything. The officer looked around at what remained. Men sitting where they had fought, some wounded, some staring outward, still expecting movement. But there was none. The battle had moved on without them. He gathered the survivors, not as a unit preparing for another action, but as a group that had reached the end of its role in the fight. He stepped forward under a white flag, each step controlled, deliberate, but heavier than before. Because he was no longer moving within a plan. He was moving after the plan had already failed. Rommel was already there, not observing from distance, not arriving late, but present, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it happened. The officer spoke with precision. He described the condition of his men: exhaustion, injury, isolation. He stated that they had followed orders, that they had held their ground, that they had not broken. And then he asked for mercy, not as leverage, not as negotiation, but as a final request. After every meaningful decision had already passed, Rommel listened without interruption, without visible reaction. When the officer finished, Rommel paused, not out of hesitation, but as if measuring the distance between what had been said and what had actually happened. Then he spoke. He said that mercy is not something granted at the end of a battle. It is something preserved during it. He told the officer that the moment to protect his men had not been now. It had been earlier, when the situation first began to fracture, when the reports stopped aligning, when the structure he depended on began to fail. That was the moment that required a decision. That was the moment that defined leadership. Not this one, not after everything had already been decided. The officer stood still, because he knew exactly what Rommel meant. There had been a moment, not obvious, not confirmed, but present, a point where the situation no longer matched the orders he had been given, where continuing to hold no longer served a purpose, where acting independently earlier might have changed the outcome. He had recognized it, but he had not acted on it, because it required uncertainty, because it required stepping outside the structure he trusted, because it required accepting responsibility before permission was given. So he had waited, and that was the decision. Rommel had not denied him mercy. He had shown him when it had been lost. Rommel did not order punishment. The prisoners were treated according to standard protocol. They were given water, medical attention, basic dignity. There was no cruelty, no excess, but none of that changed the meaning of the exchange, because what had been asked for had already been decided, hours earlier, in a moment that had passed without action. The officer lowered his gaze slightly, then nodded. Not in agreement, but in understanding, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. Rommel's advantage was never just speed, it was clarity. The ability to recognize change before it became obvious, to act on incomplete information, and still be right. He did not wait for certainty, because in a war defined by movement, certainty arrived too late to matter. He believed that waiting was not neutrality. It was a decision to allow events to unfold without intervention. And in that kind of war, that decision carried consequences just as real as action. The British officer had courage. He had discipline. He had followed orders, but he had waited for the situation to become undeniable before acting. And by then, There was nothing left to act on, because leadership is not measured by how long you can hold a position. It is measured by whether you can recognize when that position has already been lost, and act before the cost becomes irreversible. By the time a man asks for mercy, the moment that mattered is already behind him. And in that moment, Rommel made that truth impossible to ignore. Follow us for more stories from the front lines of history.